And so from a high performance standpoint, I mean, I think when we look at some of the research around, and again, this is more on the endurance side, but international to national level competitors, we see that international level competitors get sick 40% less than national level competitors, right? So if you can just show up every day in the gym or every day of practice and not miss days at the end of that year or that block of 4 years, I mean, you're going to be that much further ahead than the competition.
That was Dr. Marc Bubbs, and you're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast. Health and its role in being a stronger human being is a really critical portion of being a better athlete. If you look at the spectrum or continuum of human first, athlete second, specialist third, which Andy Ryland talked about 20 episodes ago, we realize that there are some foundational elements to training athletes that we really need to dig into to fully cover our bases and give athletes their best experience. To the end of improving our health through a variety of means, I am thrilled to have Dr. Marc Bubbs on the show today. He is a naturopathic doctor, a performance nutritionist, and the author of the best-selling new book, Peak, which is a personalized approach to health, nutrition, training, recovery, and mindset. Marc currently serves as the performance nutrition lead for the Canadian men's national basketball team. He has a portfolio of elite and professional athletes in Canada, USA, the UK, and beyond. He's the host of the Dr. Bubbs Performance Podcast, and he is an overall rock star in anything having to do with the underlying foundational principles of what make us healthy and high-performing human beings. So for the show today, we're going to get into the critical and foundational aspects of health, being sleep, nutrition, and mental de-stressing and mindset and everything that goes with that. We've certainly had other shows delving into these topics on some level, but this one puts it all together in a way that I think really helps us to see the big picture, and then also digs into some really critical areas, specifically things such as the gut biome within the portion of nutrition. What does that mean to an athlete, and what does it mean to our health and well-being? We're going to get into ideas on recovery modalities and how when you walk into a typical therapy session, you're going to see some things that are actually detracting from the recovery experiences an athlete's getting, and you'll have to stay tuned to hear exactly what that is, but it has a lot to do with technology and our screen time population. We're also going to get into sleep, and we're going to get into some things that happen once you start to dip below critical levels and how there's actually a pretty high and significant performance gap for a lot of athletes in that area. So covering these elements, how and why they're important, and digging into some critical factors is all what today's episode is all about. We're also going to get into when is it that these elements start to show up in a manner that they are going to start affecting performance. And if we want to give our athletes the best that we can, we need to really understand these things, and we need to know when a health-related issue might be at play in them not performing well, them not reaching their potential, not playing well, not winning games. And results are not just the training program. There are other foundational elements here, and Dr. Marc Bubbs is the man to talk to when it comes to these elements of health and performance. So that being said, let's get on to the show, episode 195. Marc, thanks for being here today. Could you key us in quickly, maybe the 2-minute version of your background in the industry, what you're doing right now, and some of the things that got you there? Maybe that's like a 5-minute question. I don't know, but just to start with.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for having me on, man. I'm a performance nutrition lead with Canada Basketball, and work as a consultant as well. So with elite sport, and also with recreational clients looking to improve their performance. And my background in nutrition and also in naturopathic medicine, so bringing a bit of a holistic view on athlete health and human health in terms of performance, and that's pretty much the philosophy. And again, anywhere from people trying to look better, feel better, all the way up to a lot of our guys obviously playing in the NBA and people got into the Olympics. And I'm always amazed at how a lot of the similarities, like the problems people are having at the highest level, can actually be quite similar to the problems the rest of us are having who are trying to perform at work and at home. So there's a lot of similarities, but of course there's definitely some differences as well.
Yeah, for sure. That answer kind of takes me to the first question I had for you, which is the idea of fitness versus health. And I think we hear this sometimes, the sense of someone who looks fit in the gym might not necessarily be healthy, or vice versa. And so what's for a high performance perspective, those of us who work with athletes, Like,
Yeah.
what's the, maybe it's not a point, but what's that point where poor health really starts to spill over into performance? I mean, does it start from square one? Does it have to hit a critical mass in anything? I mean, it's probably a complex question, but what would be a good indicator of that crossover between health and performance, or health and fitness?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating question, right? Because we just assume the two are so intertwined, and this is where fitness is obviously the ability to perform a physical task, health being a state of well-being, and they do travel together to a certain degree. But then when we really get to the tip of the spear, they start to veer off. And there was a great paper written maybe 3 or 4 years ago now by Prof. Paul Larson and Phil Moffitt's own "Athletes Fit but Not Healthy." And of course, the endurance crowd is definitely one that the endurance athletes are ones that tend to experience that more than even others, right? Because they're pushing the volume, they're pushing the intensity. And so this notion around, overtraining being just a person who's unhealthy, right? And so from a high performance standpoint, I mean, I think when we look at some of the research around, and again, this is more on the endurance side, but international to national level competitors, we see that international level competitors get sick 40% less than national level competitors, right? So if you can just show up every day in the gym or every day of practice and not miss days, at the end of that year or that block of 4 years, I mean, you're going to be that much further ahead than the competition. And so I think it's pretty cool now that we see this athlete health component, this human first idea being more intertwined with different performance models. And, on the female side of things, again, on the endurance sport, we just be part and parcel that if you're an elite female endurance athlete, you're going to lose menses, and that's just part of the story. And of course, chatting with experts like Dr. Susan Kleiner, new research coming out showing that women who maintain menstrual function, which again is sort of a proxy for health, right, are actually performing better at some of these elite levels. And so that whole notion that if we can keep athletes healthy, particularly in team sports, like high skill sports like basketball, or what we would call soccer, but most of the world calls football. You have these athletes who are so skilled. If you got a 44-inch vertical leap and you're the fastest guy on the floor, do we really need all these other things, or is just keeping you healthy enough to show up every day probably the biggest performance lever? So those are some of the things that you hear being discussed more now, and I think it's been interesting in practice to be able to see what are some of the less direct things that we can improve someone's performance by just supporting these areas of health that then allow them to just be them and show up and do the amazing things that they can do.
Yeah, I really like that thought with the showing up and the consistency and the stats behind that. And I had a couple thoughts. One was with distance runners in general. I always had heard the idea. I think Coach Dan John had said something like this: like, if you go to a Masters track meet, the sprinters look 10 years younger than they really are, and the distance runners look 10 years older than they really are. Yeah. And it was it's
a tough one.
I was always like, okay, that does seem about right, I guess. Like, it could make sense. But then it was like Dr. Bruce Lipton's stuff, and he was talking about DNA and telomeres and repetitive tasks. Like, if the task is ultra repetitive, it does something like to age your telomeres faster. And I was like, oh, maybe this is it. Why? But I don't know. I mean, I don't want to speak for everybody necessarily. And there probably, becomes that point where distance running is good and then turns into too much, and maybe trails versus roads or diversity. I don't know. It's just an interesting area to me.
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting as well. And I think as a heuristic, it kind of works too, because you do tend to sort of see that. And I think there's a few little areas, like obviously training outside. If you train in the sun and you live in California or Arizona, you're getting all that happening to the skin, which can impact. But I think the glucose aspect is a really interesting one, because we know that if you're, to perform on race day as an elite endurance athlete, you do need a significant amount of carbohydrate. And, month after month, year after year, depending on what kind of strategy you're using, I mean, that's going to, those advanced glycated end products are going to start to lead to, more impacts on the skin. So if you're more focused on how the skin is looking, then you may want to adopt certain strategies and maybe sacrifice a bit of performance. But I don't know, maybe that's a conversation for another podcast.
Yeah, that'd be on the very specific on some sort of running podcast and looking good or not aging, looking aged or something like that. The second thought I had from what you were saying was I love that idea of consistency, and I think it's something that we don't necessarily think of. Like, it's not very sexy to be like, well, just show up and do that as long as possible. I think that when, especially elite athletes, and I've had other talks with coaches on this podcast about there's some elite athletes who just have a really bad diet. But the question always is then, right, how long till this catches up with you? At what age is this going to catch up with you? Or is it what age is it going to start costing you? I guess that's where my follow-up to that is how do athletes with like a really poor diet and who are getting away with it in their early 20s, are these things showing up later? Is it different for everybody? What's your take on all that?
I mean, it's one that we see, you see sports now with like, Roger Federer, when he started to 34, 35, he started to lose some of those majors and it looked like, this is it for him. And of course, all of a sudden at 36, 37, he starts winning majors again and Australian Opens and then repeats and then Wimbledon. And you think, geez, the guy's now 37, 38, 39, and he's still the top four in the world. I mean, he gets to the quarterfinals of tournaments with still almost the same ease as he did when he was in his mid-20s. And that from a generation ago, I mean, when I was growing up, if you got north of 30 and you were a tennis player, man, the drop off was pretty sharp, right? So I think a lot of the science around nutrition, sleep, obviously things like recovery, obviously things like training, I think that's flattened the curve a little bit and allowed a lot of these athletes to be able to play a lot longer. I mean, Canada basketball, Steve Nash, I mean, he played till he was 40 and he had a back condition, I mean, that's just playing a point guard position in the NBA is phenomenal. And so I think that's where the buy-in can be difficult for young athletes because, nowadays you're 19 or 20 into the league. When you're that age, you're indestructible, right? You're not thinking about when you're 30. Everything just feels great. You can get away with everything. And so I think that's when having an environment where people are just making certain decisions really helps because environment is such a powerful influencer on behaviors, right? And that was one of the things that really jumped out when I was, researching and writing the book was, percentage of household spending on ultra processed food. And this just blew me away because the UK is very similar to Canada and the US. And that 50%, so half of the household grocery bill is spent on ultra processed foods, so stuff that comes in boxes and bags, right? Well, if you're in London, you can hop on a train in less than 2 hours, you end up in Paris. And now you walk out of the train station and like magic, that number has plummeted to only 14% of household spending is on ultra processed food. And you think if you just grow up in France, whether you realize it or not, your environment's forcing you and nudging you towards eating more real food, right? And the same goes, you look around the Mediterranean and we hear a lot about the Mediterranean diet. And of course, it's a little bit funny because it's like it's one diet, but I'm not a geography major, but I know there's about 14, 15 countries around the Mediterranean. So I'm not exactly sure how we got to one diet. But the key thing around all those countries is this idea that they're all eating about 14% processed food. The rest of their food is just real food. And I think, that idea then in the environment influencing them, of course, this is nothing new in sport, but I think you see this obviously now with professional sport, NFL, NBA, of trying to create environments where, the performance center has the kitchen and the breakfast is served and the more meals are being sort of controlled. And you even see this obviously at the collegiate level in the US of the quality of meals from 20 years ago, it's almost unrecognizable. Even from 10 years ago, it's phenomenal. So it's great to see that's being kind of influenced. And I think then the next stage for coaches and practitioners is to try to figure out, when we don't have the athletes, what are they doing when they're, at home and on the weekends and whatever else, right?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. It gets me thinking a little bit about, there's probably a pretty big difference between, MBA or professional and like a university level on a lot of levels. But one is, NBA players, I think, I was thinking about France and or the Mediterranean. You grow up where people love to cook, right? And like a love of cooking, it makes it easier and almost more like that's part of the culture of that non-processed food. But I feel like if you're an NBA player and maybe you're doing other things or you're used to having things maybe made for you on some level, I don't know, what I'm saying? Like versus a university, I know coaches who will have cooking classes for their athletes. I mean, is there any sort of like cooking class or, I don't, that seems kind of weird for an MBA. Do you know what I'm saying? It's just interesting to be like, love of cooking.
I think it totally is. And I think the funny thing, even when, for anyone who has kids out there, and I know you probably really, see this as well, like just the mirroring that kids have, right? So, in France, just the kids, the fact that they see their parents and people cooking the food from scratch all the time, has this impact, deep in our subconscious. And so I think that's one where, that's going to be part of it. And I think cooking classes are great because we kind of assume, it's weird the things that we learn and all the things that we think are important in high school. And then when you come out the other end, you're like, no one can actually make breakfast or lunch. It's like I think we missed something along the way here. And if you do take a cooking class, at least when I was in high school, it was like how to bake a tiramisu or something totally ridiculous, right? Like not very practical.
Yeah, as is a lot of things we learn in university and school. It's just
For sure.
just that way. I was the epitome of the person. I shouldn't say this. I feel like I'm going to get discredited, but like I didn't learn to really cook till I got to grad school, till I was 23. And it probably took me about 3 years to like 4 years to the point where I think I was actually making legitimately good for me meals and things like that for the most part. And yeah, it's something I guess I don't really think about because everything else I was eating when I did learn to cook was processed, and it just, the better I got at it, the more it was easy for me. And yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, and I mean it's a weird environment now, right? Because if we think of this generation coming up with Deliveroo or Uber Eats, or I'm not sponsored by any of these, so I'm not trying to name.
Yeah, I'm not either.
But, now things just come to you, right? And it's like, I don't know, are we again bypassing this kind of piece? And what is that? I always think of the San Antonio Spurs as an example, right? Like people talk about their culture and their cohesion, and when you talk to folks who were part of that, the dinner table was a huge part of that, right? And so obviously they were eating out, as you mentioned, but they're together, they're talking, they're chatting. Like I think that's a part of it, of trying to figure out how we kind of keep that aspect where athletes and players can kind of let their guard down a bit. They can, be authentic with their teammates and even, be vulnerable in spots and be able to share things. Because not to shift all the way over to mindset, but those are some key attributes to building trust, right? And so it's funny that you see those teams that really gel or have that cohesion tend to be doing a lot of those things together. And so, people always talk culture, and it's easy to kind of say, but I think it's difficult to kind of naturally be able to ingrain those things. And I think, maybe I'm biased, but I think a lot of it starts with food.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. It makes me think about what is it, like Greg Popovich was always like taking his team out to like all these. He had like all the restaurants and all the the wine lists and all these things that it was really elaborate. But the community element, I mean, I think that's not to be understated at all. I've been thinking a lot in just in training, not even food, but in a training session, is there any sort of group cohesion or collaboration or sense of community within the training session itself? And the energy that creates. I've had a podcast with Rafe Kelly about 20 podcasts I think ago, where I think we were talking about just that, like the emotional state before the workout, sense of community. I think the more that can exist throughout the program or the whole state of existence within the team, the better.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Actually, I was reading an article the other day, and I'm here in London at the moment, and in the Premiership, Wolverhampton's having a real big season, so they're way up the table, which is a bit unusual for them. And Portuguese manager Nuno Santos, I believe his name is, and he was talking about how if a player's late, they just don't start practice until they get there. So everyone just stands around and waits until this late player shows up. And so it's pretty cool how it sort of flips the narrative on the coach or the person in authority having to kind of wag the finger and be like, you're late, or give a fine, right? They don't give any fines. But the fact that all the other teammates are so pissed off that this guy was late is enough to create that peer pressure to make sure that, nobody's late anymore. And so I think those are always really cool strategies. If you can get the students, the athletes, the players, involved somehow in that self-policing or creating that environment where everyone the expectation is that you show up on time and everyone's ready to go. And so I think that's interesting, because I think that's a pretty novel compared to how it is even in, NBA, NFL, and some of those environments.
Yeah, for sure. And there's some point where fining can only go so far compared to the emotional impact of fining versus the emotional impact of your teammates being pissed off at you.
And that's exactly it, right? For these guys, money's nothing. But if your teammates are all pissed at you, then that price is pretty heavy.
Yeah, for sure. So moving on, and in your book, you had mentioned it, in your book, Peak, you had mentioned Penfold's recovery pyramid. And so, we're talking about health and consistency, but clearly there's things in recovery that just translate directly into training adaptation too, and are very important. And so, what's prioritized? Like, what's the top of the ladder in an athlete recovering from the work that they do, and how do you start to triage or assess that?
I mean, it's a great question, and it was something that was, and interviewing a lot of different experts, and Lachlan Penfold was one of them, former performance director for the Golden State Warriors, and of course now back in Melbourne working with the Melbourne Storm. And that idea of a pyramid, of saying, okay, at the base of this pyramid, like if we're not sleeping, if the nutrition's not on point, if this idea, we talked a bit about, mental, emotional state, if those things are really off, then it's going to be difficult to recover well, right? The next rung up for him was the training plan, as you mentioned there. And, as you keep going up towards the top of the pyramid, you get more into modalities. And so, Lachlan had a great quote where it's like, if you fuck up the training plan, I'm not sure we can swear on this podcast, but if you fuck up the training plan, it doesn't matter how many ice baths you want to take. It's not going to have any effect, right? And so I think these bigger rocks can sometimes be overlooked, especially if practitioners or trainers or nutritionists are busy and have a lot of athletes or clients, to make sure that those are really the priorities, and they're being tended to sufficiently, versus our athletes are always going to be gravitated towards, should I do cryotherapy, or should I do a warm bath or an ice bath? And it's interesting because, other recovery experts, talking to Shona Halson, it's like, well, what do they like to do? Like, what do you mean? What do they like to do? Like, why does what they like matter in this idea of recovery? Shouldn't there be a, and you see experts moving away from kind of having a, after this session we do ice, after this session we do this, to just what does the athlete enjoy? And what will the athlete do consistently? And so it's surprising, this theme of consistency, because it rings true in nutrition. And of course, as it rings true in training. But when we look at recovery, this idea that is the guy or gal going to get in there and do it every single time? And, and of course, we're seeing things around using cold and ice that is perhaps not advantageous, or potentially, negative in terms of training adaptations. So there's maybe more cause for warm in certain situations. But again, all those things are kind of at the tip of the spear. And I think when, we originally started this conversation around this longevity piece, and I think that's where, if you look at those, how the science of sleep, nutrition, mindset, training have come in the last decade or two, come so far, I think that's got to be a huge piece of why athletes are playing so well, into their mid 30s, 40s.
Yeah, 100%. I thought it was interesting in looking at that pyramid. Well, first off, I believe it was the recovery, the sleep, the nutrition, the mental, those were the bottom, and then the training was the next one on top of that, right? It was.
Yep.
Yeah, that was the same, that very similar in some level, that I was talking, a podcast I did with about 10 shows back, 15 shows back, with Logan Christopher. He had a pyramid performance, and his first brick was the mental, emotional before the training. So I just think that I find it interesting that continually kind of supersedes the actual training nuts and bolts. Like, if you're not emotionally excited, if there's not a sense of community, what you do for the training is not as important as making sure that is instilled first. And I just find it interesting that does show up. That was the second place I've actually seen that in a pyramid showing up. So I was like, oh, it's a cool trend to see.
Yeah. And it's funny because those other 22 hours of the day when the athlete's not with you, I mean, Liam Anderson, who works in the Premiership in soccer, did some work around calculating energy expenditure in football players, right? And so most of them were coming out, this was the first study done really in Premiership professional players, and they were all kind of coming out at 3,500, 3,600. And all of a sudden this one guy comes out at 4,400. And I was like, wow, that's really high. Like, what is this guy? They're looking at the training plan and everything else, this isn't right. And of course, the week they decided to do this, he has family in town. And so he's walking all over town. He's putting all these extra steps on. And so his energy expenditure is going up. And so it sort of rings true of like, you can control what you can control, but like the other hours of the day when athletes go home to their families and friends and everything else, I mean, that makes up such a big part of the time that I think that's where that mental, emotional piece becomes so important, because it is a bit of a proxy for recovery, right? Because the more run down, tired, or, incomplete recovery, then typically mood's going to follow that pretty tightly.
I wanted to take a quick break from the show to share with you a little bit about what our sponsor, simplyfaster.com, now has available in their store. You hear me mention in the outro of the show all the time about the Freelap timing system in the K-Box, which I have and use regularly. But today I wanted to share a little bit more about the bar speed monitoring units that Simply Faster has, which is the GymAware and the new portable Flex unit. So let me start with the gym wear. I mention it regularly on the show. It's been referred to as the Cadillac of bar speed monitors. Carl Valley calls it a lab inside a lunchbox, as the readings you get out of the gym wear go well beyond typical concentric or just the up phase of the lift velocities. Rather, you can measure the entire shape of the barbell lift in terms of eccentric velocity, range of motion, and total work done. Total work being awesome, by the way, especially like comparing a long-armed bench presser or a 6'10 squatter versus a 5'11 point guard. So you're getting all these extra metrics that you're not getting on other units. It's perfect for teams wanting to manage the weight room, and the data synchronizes to software platforms such as CoachMe Plus, Team Builder, and Athlete Monitoring. So new to the store is the Flex, which is the ultra portable and lower price travel version of the coach's favorite gym wear. So just like the gym wear, the Flex measures the shape of each rep, range of motion, total work done, eccentric dynamics. So for this and the gym wear, this is the advantage that a force plate would have over just knowing how high you jumped. You're getting many other metrics and information that go into this unit of work. Compared to similar portable bar speed monitors, this unit gets the entire rep rather than a fraction. So you have here two awesome tools. And if you're interested in upping your game in the velocity-based training and bar speed world, I would definitely recommend heading to the store at simplyfaster.com and checking into these two units. All right, let's get back to the show. Yeah, for sure. With sleep, too, being on one of those things at the bottom in recovery, one of the things I have heard you talking about before, and I believe you have it in your book as well, as sleep debt. It's something that I think about more, being 36 now and having two kids and things like that.
The kids definitely ramp up the sleep debt conversation, right? Like, will I ever get out of this?
Yeah, for sure. Because I mean, my first, I'd heard the term sleep debt, but I think sometimes until it happens to you, you don't really, I don't know, you maybe don't think about it very much. So in terms of the actual like sleep debt, how does that manifest itself, whether on a weekly level, like you have competition on the weekend, or is it more of can it be a chronic thing as well too? Or what are the ins and outs of that?
Yeah, I mean, lack of sleep's a big issue. I mean, if we look at the average person's getting 6.5 hours sleep, which is going to be less than the recommended National Sleep Foundation 7 to 9 hours, right? So we already know we're kind of getting a little bit less, and then you look at about 30% of people get less than 6 hours, and so all of a sudden we're chopping things off even more. And you'd think that athletes, because they know about it more, would get more, but when you look at some of the research around Olympic level athletes, then when they compare to the same age and the same sex in the general population, they actually have poorer sleep quality and more fragmented sleep. And so, we're all sort of trying to chase this idea of trying to increase, the total time that we get in bed and also the actual sleep quality, right? Because those things are going to be crucial for recovery. And as parents, when you have young kids, it's funny because in the medical literature, we always see all the testosterone levels come down, and is there a low T issue going on? And it's like, so sometimes it's funny how reductionist we can get. You think, geez, no, nobody's sleeping, right? They got kids, they're sleeping like 3 hours a night. Of course, testosterone's falling because they're not recovering, right? They're struggling. And if you have a busy job, they might be drinking more than they have in a while, or maybe not in amounts, but like consistently through the week. And so all these things start to then stack on one another. And so sleep debt is interesting because this idea of banking sleep is a notion that, the idea among sleep researchers is that you should get, more sleep if you're going to enter a period where you're reduced in terms of sleep. Because we know, if you're an athlete, reaction time, sprint time, if you're a skill sport, 3-point shooting, bat speed, all these things get impacted by lack of sleep. And so, I mean, even on top of that, actually talking to guys like Dr. Ian Dunican, who's a sleep expert in Australia, the night before a game, most people aren't going to sleep well. The night of a game, then, the adrenaline of having the game, people also, athletes then also tend not to sleep well. And if you play in a sport where, ice hockey, football, rugby, where you're taking maybe loads of caffeine before a game, that also impairs sleep. Mm-hmm. And so you got these 2 nights stacked together where you had poor sleeps. And so the rest of the week, you're actually trying to dig yourself out of that hole before the next games come. Then, of course, you can think about sports like baseball or basketball where those games are coming, more frequently. And so, I think this idea of being in a bit of a debt means that most of us need to find spots in the week where we can try to get more sleep. the difficult part there becomes most people tend to have to wake up at about the same time. And so from a behavioral standpoint, it's like, how do we get people to go to bed that half hour early, right? And this is where I think we're at the point in the sleep research, at least my interpretation from talking to a lot of these experts, is that we have all this information that tells us that more sleep's better and we got to get to this certain amount, but it's actually getting athletes and people to do it, right? Like, how do you get them to turn off the phone, get into bed, get off Instagram, get off Twitter. And so, I don't think there's a magic formula with like this particular sleep routine or this particular thing. I think it's that idea of trying to really convince the person. And, for example, in the general public, when I'm dealing with male clients, I mean, if a guy who's getting less than 6.5 just starts to get his sleep up to 7.5, he can increase testosterone by about 10% or 15% even. So that's normally one that gets people's attention, right? Mm-hmm. So all of a sudden you dangle the carrot in the right direction. But I think, otherwise it's trying to find that strategy that will, increase that sleep time for one night, but you can also think about even for the week, right? So how can we maybe add some naps in certain days? If they're collegiate athletes or younger athletes or professional athletes, they have some time. I mean, people who are working, it's tough to pull up under the desk and, take a kip in the middle of the afternoon. Mm-hmm. But for those folks, maybe the weekends are obviously a time where you might be able to get 30 minutes or 60 minutes to start increasing that weekly total, because again, it's not as sexy, but that's one where if you can start doing that, I mean, the ripple effects across the board from, we talked about missing practices and training. I mean, immunity is a huge one, right? If you get less than 7 hours of sleep, risk of cold and flu goes up about 3-fold. And if you get less than 6 hours of sleep, your risk goes up about 4.5-fold. And so whether you're a young athlete, whether you got kids at home, and that's the classic one, right? You got kids at home, so they're what we call super spreaders, right? You're gonna get, your chances of coming across a pathogen are pretty high. And of course, because you don't sleep, you're immune compromised, so your defenses are low. And that's the perfect combination for getting sick.
Yeah, going back to the Penfolds as well, the difference, like you said, the difference between 6.5 and 8 hours or whatnot being 10% testosterone, it makes me think why the modalities are at the top of the pyramid, because it's like it should almost be a thing on the modalities. If you didn't sleep 8 hours, you should be taking a nap instead of putting on the Normatec or whatever you're doing. Like it seems like people are always attracted to shiny things, but they aren't. It's almost like if you had that stat on the modality that said, if you did not sleep this XYZ, go take a nap and then come back
to square one. Yeah. It's like everyone's putting the penthouse on, but there's no foundation to the house, right? So, and I think that's where people get a benefit, right? I mean, you go in for a massage. Hey, the massage was great, but most people probably fell asleep for 30 or 45 minutes, and I think, when we talk elite sport, I think this is where there's probably it'd be fascinating to see a study around people who have treatment that just actually lie there, maybe with their eyes closed or without their phones. And nowadays, of course, everyone's lying there getting treatment on their phone.
Yeah,
so there's
double
mental stimulation going on, right? So how do we rip the phone out of their hands so they can actually just chill out and maybe take a nap or decompress or whatever it is? Because we know they're going to be on their phone later. They don't need this extra 45-minute bolus, immediately after exercise. So I think that would be interesting because, it's just everywhere now. It's ubiquitous. And so I think that's probably dovetailing with what we see with a lot of the, lack of total sleep time and the poor sleep quality we see across the population.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of places have like recovery rooms now where there's like a room devoted to it or whatnot. It almost makes sense that right? be a phone free zone too. Like you can't take your phone in here, or there's like mindfulness music or something on that's not, because you're right. If I see athletes on modalities, it would be a weird exception that they were not on their phone. Not always, but very often, you're right, they are. And so, I think people just don't understand how that's impacting you from a neurochemical standpoint. So is that something that, are there people like, is that part of what you're doing, or people that are like really making an active effort to give athletes something else? Is there something else that people would have them do, or like go draw a picture or something, like something that's relaxing, right? I don't know.
I guess it's just funny being around. My old colleague and boss used to be the head trainer for the Toronto Maple Leafs, and just the conversations and the things that would happen on a treatment table. Used to be such a huge part of and it still is. But it used to really be kind of the connector of a lot of things in terms of because even with us at Canada Basketball, I mean, the athletic therapists and the guys who have their hands on the athletes, if you can hang out at that table and just be able to listen in and slide some things in where it's in an environment that's not so sort of threatening or whatnot, it's gold. But I mean, I think now it's tough because there's this layer between, right? This you're trying to connect with somebody, but they're on their phone, and so how much attention are they getting? They're also getting the stimulation. I mean, I think it'll be an interesting one to see anyway in the next sort of decade how that sort of plays out, and I think there'll probably be some research and things coming out around that, I'm sure.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah, that makes really good sense too. With like another chance for sense of community with like the hands-on one-on-one conversation, and versus a lot of the modalities being just put this on and wear this and sit on your phone type modalities.
Yeah. I mean, those ones you can see why people sort of defer to that, right? It's like, yeah, I'm just sitting here by myself. So, but
I feel like the drawing for adults where you just like color or something. Coloring's pretty therapeutic. I hand those out.
Oh man, I mean, it is hilarious when you see things that activate the vagus nerve and whatnot, like things like humming and singing, and if you got little kids at home, you go to some of these drop-ins and all the parents are singing, and everyone all of a sudden, a minute ago everyone was in a bad mood at the, grabbing a coffee or a tea, and now everyone's having having a little sing-song, and everyone's walking out with a smile on their face. I mean, it seems so basic and simple, but you're like, wait a minute, there's something going on here. So hey,
yeah,
I don't know how that adapts to high performance sport, but got to figure out a way to blend it in.
No, I think that's a big thing. I feel like it's a little rabbit trail, but maybe not. But I like you said, I literally just started thinking about this about 2 years ago. It was I was keeping tabs on an old the college I used to work at, Wilmington. It was called Wilmington College, and their football team was very, very, very poor. And they had a guy who was kind of like a program rebuilder come in, and one of the things I noticed they were doing is the team was like singing like together after the game or something, like having a. And I was like, there's something to that. Like, I think, things like the Hawk are super trendy, and I think it's like that, but that's all different too. But just I also, there was a time I run circuit training for one of my teams, and where they'll be on a particular interval, and there was a day where I just really didn't want them to have music on because I wanted them just to focus on what they were doing and moving between the stations well. And there was some partner stations where they had to do some things together, and I wanted them to focus on that. But they wanted their music so much, some of the guys just started singing at the station on their own.
Nice.
And I was like, this is great. This is even better for, maybe exactly the reasons you said, and probably some others. I just think there's something to that. And I think it probably is more common or more accepted, I think, years ago, perhaps, I'm not sure, than it is now. But I just think there's something to that stuff.
Yeah, totally agree.
So moving on to, on to another portion. I love talking nutrition, but one thing I saw in your book that resonated with me and that I've heard other places, and I think is a really big deal, and that I haven't actually talked that much on this podcast series yet, is gut microbiomes. And obviously this could be a whole show in and of itself. But first, just like a summary of the importance of the gut biome to the athlete on both the physical and mental levels.
Yeah, it's a fascinating area at the moment in terms of research because it's really exploding. And, obviously the gut microbiota, we have all this, massive collection of bacteria and yeasts and things in the gut that are making up trillions and trillions of cells, and has a huge impact on communicating with, the brain and central nervous system. And we're starting to see some associations that happen with healthy individuals in life. So, the greater the diversity of these different bacteria in the gut will tend to correlate well with overall health and longevity, right? So we have a healthier person if we have more diversity. We see in athletes, and a lot of research initially done, Orla Sullivan in Ireland, or with rugby players, that level of fitness, we were seeing a really good gut diversity with athletes, right? So the aerobic fitness component, they had hypothesized that the protein intake as well was playing a role there. But then as you get into different sports, you start to see different collections of bacteria and what we call, a gut biome signature. So in medicine, they're looking for these kind of signatures in health that might tell you if someone has a certain, signature of microbiota in their guts, right? A certain collection of species that will then predict whether they have type 2 diabetes or Alzheimer's or certain conditions, right? And so there's a lot of advancements going on in that. And then in sport, we actually see, I interviewed a lady, Dr. Lauren Peterson, who used to work at the Jackson Laboratory, and she works with downhill racers, so downhill mountain bikers. And they actually had, depending on how the different distances and whatnot that they raced, then the strains of bacteria in the gut tend to coalesce into a certain area. And in her research, she actually found that she could predict who would finish in the top 25% just based on the bacteria in their gut. Now, this all sounds great, but you sort of think, well, why don't we just inoculate those bacteria, take a probiotic, eat some foods that are high in those things, and all of a sudden, top of the podium, we're going to knock this out of the park. And unfortunately, it's this idea of cause or effect. And so we tend to see people who are fitter and healthier. As a result of that, we tend to see this better balance of gut bacteria. Similarly with diet, the more diverse your diet. And a great example of this, a guy named Tim Spector, who's a doctor in the UK, done a lot of work around the gut microbiota. They're doing a massive study now called the Zoe to investigate a lot of these things. One of the really cool anecdotes, a little case study that he did with another researcher, was to take a sample of his gut microbiota and then travel to East Africa and live with the Hadza for 3 days and see, the Hadza have, quote unquote, sort of the greatest diversity or the best gut flora of any population on the planet. And so this idea of, well, can we rewild our gut? Can we go back to nature and get all these benefits of diversity? And of course, you're taking a guy who was already eating well, who was already healthy and fit, so he had a pretty decent diversity. He goes over there for 3 days, and they measure him whilst he's there, and they see diversity increasing, exposure to the dirt and the environment that he was in, the different foods that he was eating. But the big thing is eventually, he comes back home, right? He goes back to London, and a few days go by, and they say, okay, we're going to test you again. And so all that diversity that grew whilst he was away, when he goes back to his home environment, goes right back to where it was previously. And so, once again, the environment's playing a huge role. So we know that if you have a processed food diet, right, the diversity in your gut's going to be low. Now, if you're an athlete, you can still perform. I mean, there's nothing that's going to suggest that you can't be, we hear stories about Usain Bolt eating, depending on what story you hear, 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 chicken nuggets before he set the record. But if we get back to this idea of being healthy and being, not getting sick, not getting run down, then all of a sudden that might be a risk factor. So if you've got an athlete who's always tired, always run down, sick frequently, missing sessions, then your goal isn't inherently to increase gut diversity. But let's say if there was some testing that was done or done regularly, and that might be a marker that you see, and it's actually a proxy for this idea of athlete health or human health, right? And so there's various ways of improving that. I mean, most of the time we're trying to get, a certain amount of protein in the diet, obviously a certain amount of energy and carbohydrate, and we're looking for variety in those things. And just by doing that, right, just by getting variety in the diet, you start to support that gut bacteria. And of course, classically, things like fiber, right? The higher the fiber diet, we're going to see some better robustness in gut bacteria. But it's a really interesting field. I mean, there's trends. Guys named an expert researcher, Nick West, out in Australia, Dr. David Pine, did some work on comparing recreational to sedentary to kind of elite athletes and the different bacteria that they have. And there are some commonalities, but there's also some things that are different amongst those populations that are common to each. So, interesting area. And I think one that, again, I don't think necessarily it's going to cause performance gains, but I think it does maybe uncover if you have an athlete that's maybe struggling or not achieving the things that you want, or again, getting sick frequently, then that can be, sometimes people need to see that little bit of data to kind of show, hey, the diet's not up to scratch here. We gotta do something. Yeah,
I'm glad you mentioned that at the end too, because that was a question that I had was, could the gut biome or digestion or better digestion have any potential to improve strength or power if you're not digesting something well? But it's more of a health, or almost completely a health thing versus a performance line thing.
Well, I tell you what, I mean, this is maybe a few years down the road, but Nick was talking about how certain strains of bacteria will release more calories, right? And so, unfortunately, at the moment, these are typically people who are overweight, pre-diabetic, right? They eat food and they actually get a bit penalized, kind of more energy releases than perhaps should do. And individuals who are more lean, this isn't the case. So the notion is that if you can get an endurance athlete and inoculate bacteria that sort of release more caloric intake, more calories out of the foodstuffs that they're eating, then there is a potential performance benefit. Nothing's been seen in the research, and I think they're doing studies on that at the moment. But that's kind of interesting around, because that's always the kind of the black box, if you will. They do all these studies to calculate caloric intake. They use doubly labeled water. Everything should match up, and there's always this 100 or 200 or 300 calories that's unaccounted for. And most of the time it's just assumed that it's, we didn't track correctly or whatnot, but there could be this, it's not a pure conversion that's happening in the gut. So this could be to do with actually the gut bacteria, which potentially, maybe 10 years from now might be able to do something with that information.
Yeah. It'll be interesting as it comes out. I was with the health end. I mean, I feel like body composition in general is probably, it's both a health and a performance thing. Is there a like body fat distribution, or in terms of how well you're digesting thing? Does digestion or gut biome have anything to do with body composition as a marker, or no?
I mean, I think there you get more just into kind of generally if people are experiencing more gas and bloating and discomfort, right? There's going to be more dysbiotic bacteria, so more quote unquote bad bacteria, right? These bacteria that should only be in certain amounts have sort of bloomed up, and they ferment things quite readily and quite effectively. And so this is where you're going to have an athlete that maybe all of a sudden has bloating all the time, right? And in their diet, if you look at their diet at a quick glance, it's like, oh, all that stuff's quote unquote healthy, but some foods are more fermentable than others, right? Lactose obviously being really, one of the top ones, and fructose being, and then of course you can get into the full FODMAPs kind of diet of all the different fermentable carbohydrates. But for most, whether you're a bodybuilder, whether you're an endurance athlete, whether you're a team sport athlete, if you're a coach or practitioner and you've got an athlete that's struggling with bloating, persistent bloating, discomfort, if you just start with those two, so, lactose containing foods and then, fructose, you're going to go a long way to helping to resolve that. And you can start to maybe figure out, well, maybe that milk or that whey concentrate protein is not the right one for them, or, fruit's great for you, but hey, this athlete's just consuming so much in the day all the time, or maybe dried fruit all the time, and they do experience a lot of bloating. Maybe we can swap that out for, more rice or a different type of carbohydrate. So, because as I mean, for some athletes, it can get pretty bad, right? It can just really start to impair how they feel and performance, and it becomes kind of an anxiety thing around what they're going to eat before they play because of how they feel. So it's amazing how it can really, digestive issues tend to kind of trickle down into all areas of health, and then, moods and other ones.
Yeah.
So it's definitely an area to kind of look at.
Yeah. Having just a young child, like my son's one, and seeing just how his diet impacts his mood, and we had given him probiotics. Version, right? Yeah. We remember he was just being really fussy about. We gave him probiotics, and within almost instantly he was much better. Like, I was just thinking about that kind of brain gut, or gut mind like connection as well, and everything that goes.
Oh,
with
for
that.
sure. I mean, you get the helping hand of the bacteria to actually break down the thing they're eating, and then as you mentioned, then afterwards you have this bacteria that sets in and all these connections that take place. So it's pretty amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. So in summary, with the gut biome, really, like that guy who went to, what was the place he went to in Africa called? Hamza.
So in Tanzania, so the Hadza tribe is like one of the kind of longest living and healthiest tribes in the world.
Yeah, I was thinking, well, a side topic, I was thinking back when you said like the Mediterraneans and these people who make their own food. I feel like that's definitely got to be like the Longitudinarian, the Sicilians, or like those people in that. I'm sure the unprocessed food is a massive, massive part of all that.
Yeah, I mean, you look at those blue zones. I mean, you just mentioned it. I mean, you've got Sardinia in Italy, and Icaria in Greece, and Okinawa, Japan, even Costa Rica, Nicoya. It's all, they're just all eating real stuff, and it's different. They're not eating the same things, but and then actually in Italy, in Sardinia, they eat a lot of lamb, which is a red meat with a lot of saturated fat. So if you talk to a lot of folks in dietetics or nutrition, those are typically things that aren't top of their list for health. But you're like, well, they're all living to 100. So,
Yeah.
there's more to it than just kind of that linear or reductionist approach, right?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, definitely. That stuff's really interesting to me. And it does, it's something you don't necessarily think about when you're 18, 19, 20, but it does
Oh no,
matter.
you're indestructible then, right?
Yeah, everybody is, of course.
Don't have to worry about that.
Yeah. So for so nuts and bolts are just like what I was getting is having more fiber, unprocessed food, a diverse amount of food, but you're not going to be, you probably would have to move to those places to really be like the ultimate, like being in a
Well, I
particular.
think the one interesting thing for like if you're a coach or practitioner, the kind of counterintuitive thing is if someone's struggling with bloating and gas and maybe IBS, you typically do well by reducing the fiber, right? So reducing all these things that we tend to say increase, they're fine to increase when you're doing well, but if you're actually struggling with bloating and you add more fiber to somebody with like IBS, it typically gets worse. And so I think that's one where people can experiment a little bit and try to just reduce the number of food items to simplify things. And it's okay if the fiber actually comes down for a short period of time because they'll tend to get some benefit. And then once they start feeling better and then you can start to slowly stack things up because it is tricky because obviously, as you mentioned, when we see association studies, the higher the fiber, the better the gut bacteria and diversity, right?
Yeah, no doubt. I think it's really, it's really a fantastic. I think there's a lot of really cool information coming out on that, and I'm excited to see where it'll goes. As well as some of the new things coming out, as you mentioned. I do think I actually wanted. You mentioned it a little bit with like mental, like community, yes, but I think like mental and that aspect of training, and that was at the bottom of that pyramid too, that Penfold's. And are you doing anything like I know we have these Calm app? I think LeBron you see is like the billboard with him in the Calm app and Headspace and things like that. Quickly, what's your take on some of like the apps versus some other things that I think the app is always the easy one, but it's also the phone. What's your thought on some of that type of work for athletes? I know a lot more teams are doing like meditation and things now.
Yeah, I think the apps are definitely a nice gateway because again, most kids have their phone in their hand 90% of the time are going to be going to their phone and using apps for things. So I think that's a nice way to be able to dovetail into some of these mindfulness apps where you're actually going to start to focus on attention because, I'm sure as attention is obviously a commodity that's on the decline now, right? The ability to maintain attention, which is huge in sport, right? I think from, in talking with our sports, like Dr. Peter Jensen, this always blows me away. This idea that, we all of us, no matter how rational or evidence-based or scientific, 90% of all the decisions that we make are based off of emotions and imagery. Like that's just insane, right? And so, the ability to kind of connect with individuals and athletes is so big. And, from our end, that's what we're trying to be able to do, but also from athlete to athlete. And so, Doc Jensen does a good job of trying to layer in some of those things. But I think apps are a good place to start for a lot of athletes. For me, I think it's great if they can then progress off of the app into just their own practice because I think more and more it's going to become valuable of just getting away from your phone and just being able to kind of sit, just sit there with nothing. Because, hey, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, whether you want to breathe, whether you want to hum or mantra, whatever you're doing, but just to have some quiet time, or even if you're reading, it's amazing how that's going to become, seems like an increasingly valuable commodity.
Yeah, for sure. And the attention thing, especially. And I've seen like, especially the way a phone will work with dopamine or I think
it's madness. To think that 70 PhD psychologists are behind your phone developing it so that you're always going to be using it and everything else is like, it's 1984 or something, right?
Yeah. Do you think is there anything to the idea that if you were on your phone all day and it lowers your dopamine sensitivity, that could be a real negative thing in a gameplay situation that requires like a heightened dopamine response? Is there any research or anything like that? Or do you have any thoughts on that element?
Well, I think the burnout rates that you see across just population wide in terms of the workforce, this idea of just everyone being on their phone, from the time people get up in the morning, there's a great article recently in the Atlantic, like instead of turning over to your partner, you turn over to your phone. Throughout the whole day, we're on our phone. And the last thing you do before you go to bed is being on your phone. And so, as you mentioned, dopamine, the nervous system stimulation now that just happens. There's never a moment where you're sort of just tuned out and, sitting on the bus or the car and relaxing or chilling out, there's always something, a podcast, and again, it's amazing. I mean, we're doing, this interview, and, we'd be able to get all this information, but, I think we got to find that balance, because it can definitely, wear people out. And I'm sure you felt it, if you have a day on your laptop where you're really working throughout the day on the laptop, or you're on the phone all the time. I mean, just by the end of the day, it's, not only are you tired, but you're tired, but wired, right? You get finished, and all of a sudden now you can't sleep. I mean, you're like, wait a minute, I'm tired. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see how we sort of, I've read some articles where people, younger generations have less of a problem with that, because they've sort of born into technology than people of the kind of 35 plus. But I guess we'll see. It seems like, obviously technology is great, but we got to keep it for what it's great at, and still these human connections and everything else. It sounds funny to say, but we got to still find time for these things, because they're so valuable, especially, if you've got young kids at home, then you really realize how much this stuff's starting to kind of get in the way of connectivity.
Yeah. One of the books that's sitting on my bookshelf that I need to read is the Silence is the Key book, by, he wrote Ego is the Enemy. I don't know. For some reason, I can't remember his name. I don't know why. And The Obstacle is the Path. I can name those books, but I can't. Anyways, it's one of those things where we're talking about how silence is, like, just spending time in silence is one of the key elements of what should be your day. But how often does that actually happen? And that includes obviously not being silent, looking at your phone, just silent in the, in that field too. And it's just, people don't get much of that. I just think that's really important.
It's crazy, actually. Short story here. I was years ago after university, I went traveling, backpacking, and in Panama, there's this group of islands, and I got out there. And so for 7 days, I stayed on this island by myself. I mean, somebody would come in every day to give me food, but there was basically nothing for 7 days. And it was, at first it was really relaxing, and then it was almost sort of maddening, but just, I can't almost even imagine that now, that level of disconnectivity would just be so difficult. But, maybe we need to kind of find a way to, retreats where, I guess there is more of those now with people doing these silent retreats, but hey, I think there's something to it.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's all good stuff, and hopefully as the technology and demand for attention, the attention war increases, hopefully some of these other alternatives can at least find their way in the system to keep people in that space. So,
100%.
Hey, yeah, I learned a ton, and really appreciate having you on, Mark. Before you go, could you just key everyone in on your book? We mentioned it a couple times, Peak. Tell us about that, what it's about, how to get it.
Yeah, listen, man, appreciate you having me on. The new book's called Peak: The New Science of Athletic Performance. That's revolutionizing sports, and it's a deep dive into people who work in the high performance space, and sort of the common themes that run across the different areas that we cover, which is athlete health, fueling for various sports, recovery, and then mindset. And so it's been nice to see some of the reactions. We got a #1 on Audible and #1 on Amazon in the US, the UK, and Canada. So been some good feedback from coaches and from readers. So if people want to jump in, enjoy the conversation, want to dig a little bit deeper, then they can pick that up at any of the bookstores.
Awesome. Sounds good. Yeah, it was a great book. I really enjoyed reading it myself. So thank you, Mark. I appreciate your time today.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, bud.
That wraps up another show. Thanks for being here with us. I really appreciate you guys listening and being a part of this podcast. If you enjoyed what you're listening to, don't hesitate to leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, whatever you're listening on. I would really appreciate it, and it really helps us out. Also, just another reminder to visit our sponsor, simplyfaster.com, suppliers of high-end training technology, free lap timing system, gym wear, flex unit, contact grids, force plates. They have it all in the best of with high-tech sports training and measuring equipment, as well as an awesome blog. Be sure to check them out. All right, we'll see you guys next week with another very special episode that I've been taking some time to put together, and I think you guys are really going to like it. So we'll see you next week with that. Have a good one.